very much, and thanks for inviting me. I should say I'm no longer the chief historian, although I still do some work with the Foreign Office, but that is a bit relevant. So I'm just going to say a little bit about where I'm coming from on this before I talk about the subject of the book. The Foreign Office these days is the only major department of state that employs a cadre of professional historians within it. Other departments used to have them, but they don't have them anymore, some of which they're sorry about. And the historians have two main roles. One is to publish a series of books, which are the official history of British foreign policy, but the other is something called historical advice to ministers and senior officials. Now, that can be absolutely anything. It can be a very small thing, like a minister wanting a joke for a speech. Not very often, they're not usually very funny. Or else they think they can make their own jokes, which is very dangerous. But it can be major pieces of research. And really, the principal role of the historians is that when there is a current policy issue that has some kind of historical controversy behind it, and there are an awful lot of those, as you will appreciate, that's when the historians come in. Now, I joined the Foreign Office a very, very, very long time ago, and even when I joined, the Zinoviev Letter was already one of those things that kept coming back and kept coming back. And because it's one of those things that a lot of people have heard of, but very few people know what it is, I'm going to just say a little bit about it in a moment, just finish my own sort of little biographical bit. While I was working as chief historian, I got more and more drawn into intelligence history, and that's now really what I specialise in, various aspects of it. So obviously Zinoviev is an intelligence story, though these days it's better known as what they call a classic case of disinformation, which is something that I hope is of interest to all of you here in the sort of business you're in. So let me say a little bit about the letter itself. Now, this document was a letter supposedly written by a man called Grigory Zinoviev, who was the head of the Bolshevik propaganda organization in Soviet Russia after the revolution of 1917. And it was written to the British Communist Party, basically telling them to up their game a bit in kind of agitation and to lobby on behalf of a treaty which had been negotiated, which would mean a loan for Soviet Union. We don't need to go into too much detail here, but the point about this letter, Zinoviev was always sending letters to communist parties all over the world, exhorting them to greater revolutionary fervour. So there was nothing particularly special about that. What makes this Zinoviev letter special is when it arrived, which is in 1924. Now, 1924 saw the first ever Labour government in London. Took office in January 1924. One of the first things it did was to recognise the Soviet Union de jure as opposed to de facto. So it was a big deal for the Soviet Union to have official recognition. And then the government, among other things, was involved in negotiating these treaties with Russia, which by the summer of 1924 had been signed in draft but had not yet gone through Parliament. Now, the traditional ruling parties of Britain at the time, the Conservatives and the Liberals on the other side, they both thought it would be a good idea to let Labour take office for a while and basically bugger things up. Perhaps I shouldn't say that on YouTube, but I'm sure I can. So that they could show that they were unfit to govern. Actually, they'd done far better than anybody expected. And by the summer of 1924, both the other parties were getting a bit restive. They were thinking it was about time to get rid of them. And there was a scandal which involved a threat to prosecute a certain writer, and then they withdrew it. I mean, we won't go into all that, but we can talk about it afterwards. But essentially, during the summer of 1924, the evidence suggests that the Russians were not sending inflammatory letters because they didn't want the Labour government to fall. However, the Labour government did resign in October, the beginning of October 1924, over losing a vote of no confidence. So you're going to have a general election. It's at this point that the letter arrives. Now, I should point out that one of the disinformation factors in this whole story is that nobody has ever seen what you might call an original of this document. There's no letter in any paper form. The only text we really have is a text that was sent in a telegram from the Secret Intelligence Services station in Riga, in Latvia, to the Secret Intelligence headquarters in London at the beginning of October 1924. And although a lot of people afterwards claim to have alternative texts, the evidence all indicates that they are all retranslations of that original telegram. This is a complicated story. We don't need to have all the details. But the point is, when it arrived, the government resigns and Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, asked the King to dissolve Parliament and call an election. So he called an election on the 8th of October 1924. On the 9th of October, this telegram comes in to the Secret Intelligence Service, which is what you now might think of as MI6 was called at that time. MI6 is a Second World War termination, but it's SIS is what it was. In the usual way of these things, any kind of report like that, it was topped and tailed. It was, the things that could identify it as an intelligence report were removed from it, and then it was circulated to the Foreign Office and to certain other Whitehall departments. At the same time, rumours began circulating in London that there was some kind of inflammatory document around. Nobody quite knew what it was. Certain people started claiming they got it, even though they didn't have it. But essentially, one way or another, it was leaked to the press, to the right-wing press and particularly, and to Conservative Central Office, so that during the general election campaign, the whole letter became a big Labour bashing instrument. And the reason for that was that the right-wing interests claimed that the letter showed clearly that Labour was enthralled to the Reds in Moscow and that they could not be trusted, and therefore. So all through the campaign, there are rumours about this letter, and it was eventually published by the Daily Mail. Who else, one might say? On the 25th of October, the election was taking place on the 29th. Now, there are all sorts of complicating factors in this, one of which is the official response to the letter. As I said, Zinoviev sent lots of documents like this, and at first, nobody seemed to pay too much attention to it. They didn't think it was different to anything else. But then they started to worry about it in the Foreign Office because partly of there being a general election campaign, and because they felt it was so outrageous, there had to be some kind of official response, because if the letter were to be leaked and spread around, and it looked as if they hadn't done anything about it, that would reflect badly. So a response was drafted in the Foreign Office, and the draft, sorry, follow me on this because this bit of it is important, though it's slightly obscure. The draft note of protest from Britain to Soviet Russia was sent from the Foreign Office to Ramsay MacDonald, who was both Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister at this point. He's in Wales campaigning for the general election, so he's not in London. He's actually by himself. It's not like it is today. He was on his own with just a typist, no advisors, no secretaries, no nothing. He gets the draft, he amends it quite extensively, and he sends it back to the Foreign Office. At this point, the Permanent Under-Secretary, which is the top official in the Foreign Office, decides that the amended version must be what MacDonald really wants to send, and he gives that version to the press, and he also gives the text of the Zinoviev Letter to the press, so that they are both published on that fateful 25th of October. Now, MacDonald claimed that he had not at all intended that his amended draft should be sent out and published. He wanted it to come back again so that he could sign off on the revision. This has never been satisfactorily resolved, because later on there are some documents missing from the file. A good old story, a mystery story, so that it's impossible to be absolutely sure. But whatever happened, it's not actually the content of this document, it's what was done with it which makes it important and which qualifies it as a disinformation document. Now, the difficulty is, you can say, okay, it's disinformation, but by whom, against whom, and for what purpose is much more difficult to gauge, because it very soon began to be suspected that this document was not actually from Zinoviev at all, that it had been forged some people said the Labour Party, having lost the election, although this didn't lose the election for them, but they lost the election, they then accused everybody really, the Conservative Party, the civil service, the intelligence services, everybody they regarded as the establishment, they accused them of concocting this document in order to damage Labour's prospects in the campaign. But the question is, who did actually forge it? And we still absolutely don't have a definitive answer, though there are lots of possible candidates. Indeed, it could conceivably have been concocted in this country, though that is less likely, I think. But there are very many different constituencies, all of whom had an interest in causing trouble in the British political establishment, or indeed causing trouble in Moscow, because it is possible that even if Zinoviev didn't write it, it might have been forged as part of an intra-Bolshevik power struggle, because at this point we know that Stalin was trying to discredit Zinoviev, who was one of his rivals, and so there's a possibility that it was actually done to disrupt Bolshevik politics. It may have been forged by what were called White Russian interests, that is, the people who were against the Bolsheviks but who were Russians, a lot of whom were in exile in Germany or in France and in the Baltic states, busily intriguing and trying to get rid of the Bolshevik regime in Russia. And then, of course, you've got the whole convoluted state of British politics as well. So everybody was accusing everybody else without ever being able to quite get to the bottom of it. But it became known as a political dirty tricks example that was raised in successive elections time after time. In fact, there isn't a decade since the 1920s when the Zinoviev Letter has not been raised in the media or in politics or in the course of an election. In 2017, during the election campaign, 2017, you may remember there were all kinds of things in the press about how some remarks made by European Commission officials might have been deliberately placed in order to interfere with the electoral process. I mean, it was just like the Zinoviev Letter, they said. It's one of those things that people bring up. The real truth of it is very difficult to ascertain because, it is a very long time ago. Now, I came into this story, as I say, when I joined the Foreign Office, it was already one of those controversies that never quite went to bed. But then in the 1990s, when the Labour government came in, when the Blair government came in, it came up again with a vengeance. And in 1998, a book was published. This book was written by Nigel West, which is the pen name of a former Tory MP, Rupert Allison, and a former KGB colonel called Zinoviev. This book was called The Crown Jewels, and The Crown Jewels was the code name for information given to the Russians by the so-called Cambridge spies, Philby, Burgess and Clayton and Blunt and so on. And this book purported to have all sorts of stories about British history based on that information that was held in Russia, having been transmitted by traitors. There was a chapter in this book on the Zinoviev Letter, which said it had definitely been written by a man called Pokrovsky, Ivan Pokrovsky, who was a former Tsarist officer. The book caused quite a stir in this country. There were questions in Parliament on the lines of, why do we have to read about our history on the basis of what traitors have given to Russia? And the Foreign Secretary, who was then Robin Cook, at first he was absolutely astonished that anybody could get exercised about something that had happened in 1924, but then he soon realised that in the Labour Party, the Zinoviev Letter was still very much a sore point and a hot issue, and so he ordered an investigation. Now, the complicating factor, of course, is that the real evidence on all this lies in the archives of the UK's intelligence agencies. And in particularly in SIS archives, which are not open to the public. and this is how I came into it, because he stood up in the House of Commons. Over my career, there have been a number of occasions when a minister has stood up in Parliament and said, I have ordered a full investigation from my historians. They never tell you this beforehand. You just find out afterwards. However, he said precisely this, and so my role was, because I have privileged access to these archives, was to go in and to try and find out the truth. He still didn't really believe that anybody could be terribly exercised about something that happened so long ago, but he was soon disabused of that. I mean, when the official report at the end of my investigation was published in 1999, there were a lot of messages that came into the Foreign Office saying that their relations or somebody had been involved in it, or they always knew. There was one particular guy who's a very, if you do read this book, there's a very strange guy called Donald Imthorne, who, despite his name, was actually a British Conservative. His son got in touch with me after the report was published to say, my father would never have been involved in anything like this. His grandson, who was living in Italy at the time, sent me a fax saying, I always knew my grandfather was involved in this. So even Robin Cook was convinced that you can't quite put the Zinoviev letter to bed. Now, we didn't manage to get to the bottom of everything, but I did go to Moscow as part of this investigation, which was very interesting. This was actually in the fairly briefish period between the end of the Cold War and when things didn't go quite so well, when actually relations with Russia were pretty good. They cooperated in our investigations, and they were very helpful to me, and so, you know, it was all absolutely fine at the time, because they have an interest too. And you are often, you know, ever since I did this, I keep an alert on my name on Google, I know you'd be glad to know, not just to be vainglorious, I assure you, because you get particularly Russian websites saying, Gill Bennett has said X or Y. I mean, I never have, and there's nothing I can do about it, but I like to know that somebody said it, if you see what I mean, because you never know when you're going to be ambushed. It's just kind of the fixed. It's partly to do with this particular story, which remains inflammatory nearly 100 years later. There were definite accusations that the British intelligence community were involved in this whole thing, and that indeed they concocted the letter. I think the idea of them concocting the letter is unlikely. I think it entirely possible that some members of the SIS, including a man called Desmond Morton, whom I also wrote a book about, who was a very, very secret squirrel, that he knew this letter was forged, and he and certain other people in the intelligence community who absolutely had no time for the Labour Party smoothed it on its way into the public domain, shall we say, and were not displeased at the way it was used. But it is certainly a case of disinformation. It was smearing the Labour Party in a way that was unfair, because actually they were absolutely not in thrall. They were very anti-communist. They were not in thrall to Moscow. But of course, even in the 1920s, and this is actually one of the contemporary lessons of this episode today, everybody talks now about disinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, going around the world in seconds because of the internet and digital communications generally. Of course, that's true. But even in the 1920s, a story could get round pretty damn quickly, and it only had to be mentioned in the press, and it had legs, and those legs could run an awful long way. So it's not, there's no kind of enormous change, and how you might deal with disinformation is not that different. The kind of techniques that were developed at the time to try, how do you counter this? How do you look at stories which you think might be false? And there, you know, techniques that are used in the intelligence services. First of all, you look at the source. What do you think the source was? But also you try to look at intent. You know, in a military parlance, capability plus intent equals threat. If you look at where you think the story is coming from, and what interest whoever it is you think it might be might have, and that does help A, to try and identify disinformation, and B, to try and think how you might be able to respond to it. And actually, they certainly didn't use those terms in the 1920s, but there were people who were trying to do that then. I want to mention one particularly tricky character in all this story who illustrates the kind of problems that they were faced. There is a man called Vladimir Orlov. Now, Orlov had the distinction of having worked in the Tsarist secret police, in the Bolshevik secret police, and then for White Russian organizations in exile. He set up a forgery bureau in Berlin in the 1920s. He was given accommodation and facilities by German intelligence. He was paid money by French intelligence, by SIS, by Red Russians, and by White Russians. And he and his colleagues manufactured documents to order. It doesn't mean they were all absolutely false, but they were expert. And so trying to find out whether a document like the Zinoviev Letter really was true was almost impossible, because after all, Bolshevik Russia is shrouded in it's a very secret state. They're not going to tell you much about it. And Zinoviev's own reaction to it was, well, I didn't actually write that one, but if somebody had put it in front of me, I would have signed it, which is not terribly reassuring, really. Now, Orlov, characters like Orlov, and he was not the only one, make the whole story pretty tricky and make it difficult to really get to the bottom of this. And all through the decades, it comes up, as I said, in general elections. It came up during a Labour government, Harold Wilson's two governments, when, of course, Harold Wilson, already rather paranoid about the activities of the intelligence agencies, in the background of Labour, Zinoviev Letter is very much something to conjure with. As I was just saying to one of you beforehand, Jack Straw, former Foreign Secretary, with whom I worked quite closely when he was there, he says Zinoviev Letter is mother's milk to him. His father, who had been a plumber and who was a Labour activist and a trades unionist, his father had taught him about Zinoviev Letter when he was a little boy, as a classic example of the kind of things that the establishment does to do Labour down. Well, he's not the only one who takes that view. Another factor that I'll stop for a moment for questions, but another person I need to bring into this story is Kim Philby, whom I'm sure you all know about. Of course, he's one of the Cambridge spies. But there was a major investigation, a cross-Whitehall investigation in the 60s that was done as a direct result of the defection of Philby. Now, Philby, of course, had been suspected in the 50s and indeed left SIS, but he'd been exonerated. He bluffed it out, essentially. They couldn't get the evidence. And SIS kept on defending him and saying they were sure he was not a traitor, so that when he did actually defect in 1963, it was an enormous shock to the whole of the intelligence establishment. And they got together, the different agencies, and they said, look, if this can have happened and we didn't know, what else might there be? So they formed a committee to try and go back through the history of operations of the intelligence services to look at other cases where there might have been disinformation, something treachery that they had not detected. And one of the cases they looked at was the Zinoviev Letter. And they commissioned a formidable lady called Millicent Baggott, who just retired from MI5, to run this interdepartmental organisation inquiry. And she did very much what I was to do 30 years later. She looked in all the intelligence agency archives and so on. But of course, in the 1960s, you couldn't admit that MI6 or MI5 or GCHQ actually existed. They were not yet on a legislative footing. They hadn't been avowed. You weren't allowed to talk about, you weren't allowed to release a document that referred to any of the agencies by name or that indeed referred to their activities. So everything that she did was under wraps. And indeed, her report has never been published, although I was lucky enough to be able to draw on it extensively when I came round. Now, the time I do my investigation, of course, the whole legislative framework has changed and all the agencies were on a legislative footing. You were allowed to know that they existed. You were allowed even to mention their heads. And so it was much easier to then be able to talk about, in our report, to talk about what SIS or MI5 or anybody had been doing in the years beforehand. Now, it still hasn't gone away. I was asked if I would like to write a book about this because it kept coming back. I mean, we didn't put it to bed in 1999. It comes up again and again. It came up in the referendum campaign when there was an article, for example, criticising the way that the Daily Mail were laying into David Cameron during the referendum, EU referendum campaign, because of him, you know, obviously campaigning, though perhaps not very hard, for remaining. This is just like what they did to Ramsay MacDonald over the Zinoviev Letter. So it comes back. When I actually started looking for mentions of it, I found they were everywhere. And so it is literally the conspiracy that never dies. And although I've moved, I hope, the debate on a bit, in that in the end, I do think that Pokrovsky, who was fingered in the 1998 book, is certainly a very credible candidate. But who asked him to do it? I don't know. And there are still any number of candidates, which means that although I've been able to bring a lot more stuff out into the open, it's not dead yet. And the message of the book really is that good conspiracies never die. I'm going to stop there and take questions. Is that okay?